Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Buena Vista Hybrid Wash Processed Colombia from Moxie Coffee Co. And there's the bag right there. And Moxie, based out of Phoenix, Arizona. And they were a suggestion to us by Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy, and One Man's Chorus. So shout out to and thank you to Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy, and One Man's Chorus for the suggestion. This is Moxie's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. While doing some background research, I found out that the owner is a former Corvus employee, and Corvus is a coffee roaster that I do have a long and extensive history with. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this coffee compares to those experiences, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, you can definitely feel a fair bit of Corvus's influence on this one, as I would say that this coffee is pretty similar to some of the coffees I have had from Corvus in the past, if not slightly lighter than some of the experiences I've had from them as well. So I feel like most people would align this one with being on the lighter side of that light medium in terms of that roast profile. One final note, since this is our first time reviewing Moxie, the coffee roasting machine that they use is the Diedrich for anybody that's curious. Well, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression. And we did opt for the V60, and it was an interesting experience as there was a fair bit of clarity at the forefront, but it transitioned into this slightly strange bitterness that I best described as being reminiscent of dark honey. In addition to that, there was a slightly tart and citric aspect with a papery quality too. So for the most part, it was just an okay first impression. We continue on to day 23 as we opted for the Chemex, and it was notably better through this brew method as there was just better sweetness and definition to the honeysuckle-like aspect of it. But the trade-off was that there was a little bit more fermentiness to the cup, in addition to that a slight bit of stone fruits that also had a slightly fermenty feel to them. Nonetheless, it was better all around. So we'd continue on to day 26 as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup continues to skew in a surprisingly bitter honey sense as that was present yet again. It did feel a little bit more even though, as there was less of that papery quality, as it was followed a bit more by the lychee in line with the listed fermented red fruit. So this one was just okay once again. It was one of those things where I was either getting a fair bit of the papery quality or a fair bit of the red fruit in a fermenty sense, so hasn't necessarily been the best experience up to this point. We continue on to day 29 as we opted for the V60 with lower temperatures, and I felt like it really helped balance this coffee out as there was a little bit more clarity as the honey also felt better defined. Though there was still a very strong bitterness in this coffee, that's something that we would still continue to need to work with from this point going forward. Papery quality also still felt present, as I've heard people describe this kind of papery quality, and that's how I describe it, as being reminiscent of kiwi. And since there's a tropical note on here, I could say, okay, maybe I can see that in a little bit of a loose sense. But for the most part, for me, it's always tasted a little bit more papery is kind of the best way I can describe it. Cup remains intense with a sharp brightness and a slight caramel finish, better, but at this time it was still a little overbearing. We continue on to day 32 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments and had similar impressions as the previous day, as the intensity of the cup is still toned down relative to some of the earlier experiences, but the strong honey bitterness is still dominating the cup. There is a slight chocolate quality as well, with the red fruits also present but toned down. So the best thing I was getting from these adjustments was toning down a little bit of the fermenty red fruits, which I feel like that and toning down a little bit of the honey bitterness was a trade-off that was definitely worth it. Continue on to day 35 as we opted for the V60 with lower temperatures once again, and it's paying dividends on the forefront as there's a lot less of the strong bitterness, leading to just better definition overall. Could say I'm feeling a little bit more of a mango-like component to it and stone fruits in general. Issues come more on the back end, as this time I felt a little bit more of the grainy quality and more of that papery quality as the cup has cooled down. So it's been tricky to work with, and at times I'm still getting some undesirable effects that I was looking for from this one. Continue on to day 40 as we opted for the Chemex, and I opened the bag and there was that notably stale coffee smell to the actual bag itself, though it didn't necessarily lend itself towards having any issues in the cup, as having it toned down with the Chemex was a really nice experience for it. It felt a little bit more hollow with that papery quality, as it's still present, but the rest of the cup felt almost lemon water-like with a little less of the sweeter components to it. Day 43, interestingly, it was actually the best experience we had going back through the V60, and that does help because we made the tasting wheel on this day, as it's offering plenty of the previously mentioned aspects, all of those things. So the red fruits, the stone fruits, that slight papery quality, that honeyed sense, the florality, all of those things definitely still present on this day. Bitterness and what I describe as unripened pineapple bitterness also still present, with that lychee-like component also present within this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish, level 4. So that might be one of the better parts of this coffee, given that this is a little bit more of a processed coffee. I'm not entirely sure what hybrid wash means most of the time, because I feel like that can be used to describe the processing in a number of ways. But in this case, you can definitely tell that there's just a slight bit more processing than with a true wash processed coffee. And with that being said, it's not overbearing in terms of just how long lasting you're feeling the intensity of this coffee. At the end, it does come out a little bit more candied, so I'm getting a little bit more of the caramel aspects, which I think I could have bumped up to a level 3. I digress. It does have a much more even finish to it, especially after the adjustments we have made. Sweetness, level 4. This one's a little generous. I do have to say that it's maybe on the slightly lower side of the level 4, as the sweetness does come a little bit more in that slightly candied sense and a little bit more of the floral sense. There is some fruit sweetness to it as well, but for the most part, I think I'm just getting a little bit more from the florality as well as that ever so slight brown candy-like aspect. Acidity, level 4. Once again, lower side of level 4. I feel like maybe toning down this coffee in the way that we have has really kind of toned that down as well, given that there was a very sharp brightness to this coffee, especially on some of the earlier days. But I think I was really working to maybe keep some of the undesirable aspects toned down, and as a result, the brightness of this one was a victim of that. And as a result, it is on the lower side of level 4, not necessarily the brightest coffee, but I felt it's still justified. You're still feeling the brightness enough to put it at that mark. Florality, level 4. My favorite part of this coffee, without a doubt, as the honeysuckle-like aspect to it does kind of contrast the bitterness, and that's where things get kind of interesting, given that there is that strong honeysuckle, but there is also that very strong honey bitterness to it. And I think that in certain ways they go together, but for the most part, I try to isolate and separate and focus heightening the honeysuckle-like component as opposed to that bitterness. But at the end of the day, I do have to say that it was one of the more enjoyable experiences of this coffee. Brave fruit, level 4. So when I saw red fruits on here and I saw that this was a slightly more processed coffee, I said, you're really taking a gamble purchasing this coffee. And truth be told, given that it wasn't overbearing, I think I can live with that. That's a victory in itself. So that lychee-like component, anytime I do experience it, then it's not necessarily my favorite. And I've said in the past that anytime there is that note, or anytime I do taste it in coffee, even lychee itself, when you have it in a jelly drink, it has that sort of fermenty taste, that fermenty feel to it in general. So I shouldn't be surprised that that was present within this coffee. Having it there at the level 4 definitely seems like the best place for it. Citrus fruit, level 4. I feel like on some of the earlier days, I basically described it as being an undefined, just generic citric component. Towards the end, I could say it has enough of a bitterness for this coffee that I can also see it in a citric sense, but a little bit more in line with like an unripened pineapple as opposed to something like a very bitter lemon. We continue on to a number of level 3s. We'll start with the stone fruit since we're already there, level 3. So I did mention at times there was a mango-like attribute, sometimes slightly more fermenty as well. And I think that that also played in with the rest of the coffee, having just a little bit more processing, a little bit more intensity to it in general. The savoriness, level 3. There's also a very interesting herbal aspect to this one that I feel like maybe isn't something that I mentioned too much. It is in the much more floral sense, so I could actually see something a little bit more in line of a rose, or even more in line with a hibiscus-like attribute within this one, as I feel like that also had a little bit of a role in it, given that it had a slight bit of a red tone to this cup. Body level 3, I remember making that part of this tasting wheel and thinking to myself, okay, this one has just a little bit more texture, and I do like that about this coffee. I really like the more medium-bodied aspects of this. And then the final thing that's really worth discussing, and that is a cleanliness, level 3. So it does have a number of things, and that papery quality, which again, I think people would maybe most closely align it with being something like a kiwi. I don't think that that's necessarily what takes away from the clarity. I think maybe a slight bit of the fermentiness to it, but a general lack of, I would say, really specific definition and just how heightened the bitterness was within this coffee. I feel like those two things really seemed to take back from the overall clarity of it. And I guess I'm not really surprised whatsoever that it scored at the level 3 mark. I was ambitious and optimistic that maybe hybrid washed would insinuate a higher level of clarity. Though this one did at times present a little bit more definition to it, I don't necessarily think that it was ever going to reach that level 4 mark. And actually, I should discuss one more thing, and that's the bitterness, which I have all the way down there at the level 2. It's the higher side of level 2. I feel like with this tasting wheel, I was being a little generous with a lot of the scores that we have on here. Bitterness, by the end, I would say that I was able to get it toned down. And maybe the reason it's at the level 2 is because on some of the earlier days, it was just so strong at that level 3, maybe even pushing the higher side of level 3, that by the end, when I was able to get it at a much more reasonable place, then level 2 felt like the best place to put it. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. So I specifically picked this one out because I knew that this could be a little bit of a cop-out when it comes to reviewing a coffee, where I've said in the past that I like to do one wash and one non-wash processed coffee. So this technically counts as the non-wash processed coffee. And I guess if I'm comparing it alongside of just general non-wash processed coffees, then by that standard, I like it typically more than the average non-wash processed coffee. But truth be told, this coffee was something that I feel I may not have necessarily gotten right. This is the aroma I was getting from the coffee when I brewed it, the aroma from the whole beans themselves, so I feel like this is the way that the coffee is meant to be. I just can't necessarily explain this overall experience, given it had a lot of things that on paper I wasn't really expecting, and in the actual cup itself isn't something I typically experience from too many coffees. It still had nice intensity, it still had nice sweetness to it, but the clarity really seeming to offer a little bit of an interesting fermenty as well as slightly papery quality to it, and that's the things that's really sticking with me, especially that bitterness. I'm not entirely sure what this coffee or the direction of this coffee was supposed to be. So for that reason, I just don't think it was necessarily my preference, but even then, it's still, again, a little bit better than a lot of the natural processed coffees I have these days. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you've liked tropical fruits in the past, then this one is a pretty good fit for that. As I kind of mentioned, it had a little bit of a mango, a little bit of a pineapple, a little bit of what people describe as that kiwi components to it, and a little bit of that lychee. So it offers plenty of fruits. It offers plenty of intensity, and I would say above average clarity for a non-wash processed coffee. So all of those things are a good place to start, fair bit of body, and that honeysuckle-like components to it, definitely my most desired aspect of this one. Contrasting with we'll just say a little bit more interesting of a bitterness that complements or contrasts the rest of this coffee, and you at least have a little bit of an interesting drink, a little bit of depth. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Buena Vista Hybrid Wash Processed Colombia from Moxie Coffee Co. Thank you for watching.